thank you to everyone for coming, and welcome to the very first Harry Baglole Memorial Public Symposium in Island Studies, measuring quality of life on Prince Edward Island. My name is Lush, and I'm going to be the chair for the evening. If anyone needs a washroom, if you go out this door onto the corridor there, turn right at the end, you sort of curve around left, and that's where they are. There's also drinking water available there. The event sponsor this evening is UPEI's Institute of Island Studies, in conjunction with UPEI Research Services. So the format this evening is we're going to have 3 presenters, and then follow that with a discussion and questions from the floor. And we will try and wrap it up by 8:30 at the latest because of the weather. So our first speaker is Gwen Colman. In 1997, Gwen and her husband Ron founded UPEI Atlantic, a pioneering research organisation in creating new measures of well-being and progress. UPEI Atlantic has worked around the world helping to develop genuine progress and well-being measures. Gwen will identify the elements for creating successful community partnerships to measure well-being and their resultant impact. The next speaker will be Dr. Jim Randall, who is UNESCO Chair in Island Studies and Sustainability, Chair of the Institute of Island Studies, and Coordinator of the Master of Arts in Island Studies programme here at UPEI. Jim's background is as an economic and social geographer. He's written more than 35 peer-reviewed articles and book chapters in the area of quality of life indicators, economic urban geography, and community-university research collaboration. And our third and final speaker this evening is Wendy MacDonald. Wendy has worked in many areas of public policy, both within government and as a consultant. Her best memories include a number of Harry Baglole's visionary projects and, in a volunteer role, her participation in the Quality of Life Island Co-op. In 2008, Wendy rejoined the provincial government and has worked on various policy projects. As Secretary to the Cabinet Committee on Priorities, she works to support Cabinet decision-making and to strengthen policy capacity in government. So to start with, Jim will say a few words about Harry Baglole.
Thank you very much, Andrew. And I was just looking at the picture behind me, and I didn't even realize until just now. Look up the top there, the top of the mast.
Oh.
See the little Finland flag at the top of the mast. I didn't realize, and that sort of is sort of perhaps another fitting tribute to Harry. And I'm probably one of the least sort of worthy people perhaps to talk about Harry, because so many people in the audience here probably know Harry much better than I do. I know his longtime friend and former wife Sue couldn't be here, and his 2 sons, Sebastian and Keith couldn't be here as well. But Jack McDougall, his nephew, I'm glad to see you here, Jack. And I know that there are others that have memories of Harry that go a long way back. My interactions with Harry sort of came late in the game, I guess you could call it. My first exposure was when the Institute of Island Studies was going through a bit of a hiccup in terms of its budgeting and resources. Harry, I remember seeing Harry in the back of, we had a community meeting up at one of the lecture halls in UPEI, and Harry was this character sitting in the back. Well, I really didn't know who this guy was back there, but I sure found out pretty quickly who he was. After the university sort of reconsidered a bit in terms of some of the preliminary decisions that were being made, Harry formed part of the planning committee to restructure the institute, create a new governance structure, and it was only fitting that he played that role given his instrumental role in crafting the direction for the institute early on in its days. And Harry kept us, both in that committee as well as in his role on the institute from that point on the executive committee, kept us grounded in this island community of his. He could move equally well within the university administration and in the community. For someone who did so much for so many causes well beyond just island studies, I got the sense that he was a very private man. He did not necessarily relish the spotlight, and he was much more comfortable doing the hard work and letting others speak. He was also one of those rare people who was capable of focusing on the big ideas, and I sort of smiled a little bit when Wendy made that statement there. Some of you might, in fact, recognize this next characteristic in him. Harry would call me, and during the course of about a 10 to 15 minute call, would raise idea after idea. And I sort of got the sense that my idea was like a sieve or a colander. Sort of as those ideas came raining down to the colander, trying to capture the ones that sort of, that could bear fruit. And sort of, because there were just so many of them. So my job, I felt my job really was try to corral that big idea sort of character that he was. So why did we rename this series, the Institute of Island Studies renamed this series in Harry's name? I think, and I think the rest of the executive committee agreed with me, that the series, and we've had over the last several years, probably 8 or 9 recently, public symposia on issues sort of the day that are of value to Islanders. It sort of epitomizes what Harry was striving for in his years of service to the Institute and to the island. Connecting the university to the community and doing what we can do to contribute to public policy debate and the development of the island. And also these symposia are intended to look at various sides of issues. And be a forum for debate without necessarily being an advocate for any one side, but let the audience contribute and understand the many sides and facets of very highly charged issues. And my final point here is, given his reluctance to take center stage, I know that Harry, where he is right now, might feel a little uncomfortable about the symposium being named after him. But I couldn't think of a better way to preserve his legacy. So Harry, wherever you are, thank you very much. And I know many other people in the island thank you as well. And I'm going to turn it over here to Gwen now. So let me put this up here. Get this going.
I just want to.
There we go. Yes, it is. Yeah.
I just want to start by saying, actually, the original invitation for me to come and speak here with you today came from Harry, and we corresponded for a while and had a number of phone conversations, and I can really agree with you about the ideas and the bubbling of them. So it was actually quite fun to speak with him. So I'm very honored to be giving this talk tonight.
Just use the right arrow to...
Right. Okay, this way?
Yep.
Okay, great. So first, I'm going to introduce myself. I'm Gwen Colman, and tell you what GPI Atlantic is. GPI stands for Genuine Progress Index. So we first started with the idea of creating a full index for Nova Scotia, an index of well-being. Not just indicators. So an indicator is something that you measure. It could be inches, it could be temperature, it could be the number of people that attend a talk. So you can choose just about anything to be an indicator, but an account adds value. It shows the value of that indicator. So what GPI has done that's unique is we did full cost accounting for many indicators. 22 sets of indicators, actually, and we were able to assign an economic value where it would, in many cases where it hadn't been assigned before, and we felt that gave more power for speaking with governments who often make their decisions by dollars and cents. So we exist alongside the GDP, not instead of the GDP. And here's a few things that we've been involved in over the years. So we wanted to address the myth of economic growth. I was just talking to Peter Lush, who was saying to me, money drives everything. And I said, no, I'm going to prove it does not. So actually, we think that economic growth is good, but it actually creates resource depletion. It leaves a poorer world for our children. consumption and energy use, we also have more greenhouse gas emissions. So we're not necessarily better off. If we have more crime, sickness, and pollution, that makes the economy grow because money is being spent, which is what the GDP is all about. How much money is being spent and the value of all goods and services. For example, if you have an oil spill, that creates a lot of money in the GDP. 39 billion was the amount that the Exxon oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico added to the global economy. So this makes policymakers and governments have a skewed message. It says, okay, now we have lots of money. It's not that bad because of all the money being spent on the cleanup. So it created a better economy. Actually, nobody did count what the cost of this oil spill really was because nobody counted lost tourism, destroyed ecosystems, etc., etc. So, of course, that's another example. So since these measures of progress send the wrong messages, how do we start to send the right messages? What we measure shows what we value. So the reason that everybody thinks that money is what is valued is because that's what we're measuring. Everybody is calculating the GDP monthly at great cost. And I have to say that a person who helped start GPI way back in pre-97 was Hans Messenger, who was in charge of calculating the GDP for Canada for about 20 years. And he felt so strongly that something else, other measures were needed, that he helped us and still helps us. So it also determines what makes it onto the policy agenda, and it influences behavior. So, for example, Marilyn Waring wrote a book and made a film called As If Women Counted, and it changed everything. You're constantly seeing this today in the feminist policy of Canada, of the Canadian government. Feminist development policy comes directly from this work. Because, people continued and they found out that if you invest in girls, your payback on that investment is much greater than if you only invest in boys. For example, if a girl receives an education, she goes back, she helps her community 80% of the time. And we found that when we were publishing indicators, we got people on side, and you could actually change behavior. For example, when we did the Nova Scotia waste strategy, everybody was saying, all our naysayers were saying, okay, you're not going to get people to help. But when the report came out and Nova Scotia adopted the Nova Scotia waste strategy, 50% of diversion from the landfill was achieved by getting people on board. And then people were coming from all over the world. In fact, Halifax was #1 community in the world for waste diversion. So people from Japan and Germany and all over copied the practices. So another example is on the other side. If you have voluntary work, it is not counted in the GDP. But what if you stopped volunteering? Then the government would have to pay for that. So if you start to count what volunteerism actually contributes, then people have to pay attention. So we gave a check to the Premier of Nova Scotia for $1.8 billion, which was the value of volunteerism in Nova Scotia. And right after that, they started an office to promote volunteering and put money into professional development for volunteers, because we also showed that there were 12% downgrade of 12% over a 10-year period in the number of volunteers. And there's burnout because too many people are doing the same volunteering over and over again. So I think volunteerism is very important. So if you create a good set of indicators, then, and it's something I want to talk about more later, and I know that Jim has done a lot of work around this, is that you can start from shared values. And this is so important because we know now, over the last 40 years of research, that the single most important indicator of well-being is a sense of community and a sense of belonging. That is for physical health as well as mental health and in all sorts of other arenas. So we know that if you are inclusive and people are participating in their community, then you're going to have all kinds of benefits of well-being across the board. So we take this view that we're existing within the environment, within the society, and the economy is the inner circle, but it's not running the show. It's a different view. I think that usually the economy is the big circle, and everybody thinks that everything else has to bow down to it. But because we count what is usually called externals, and usually not counted at all, it makes a much more realistic picture. So for example, we measure your health, your free time, unpaid work like such as the voluntary, and also the value of education. We've done a lot of groundbreaking work in valuing what is an educated populace, and going against the grain, actually. Some of our work was suppressed in Canada for several years because it challenged the usual measures, which are just test scores and dropout rates and so on, and we were looking at literacies in a much more holistic way. So the way that we look at it is that sickness and crime and disasters are costs. Natural resources are capital assets, so we have natural capital. Reduction in greenhouse gas, crime, poverty, and ecological footprint are progress, and growing equity signals progress. So many times if you're looking, for instance, the GDP of a country, and you say, well, that country is rich, but it isn't necessarily rich. Maybe only the top 20% are rich, and the other 80% are in poverty, is in the case in some countries in the Middle East. So we know now what the basic elements of well-being are. And I think this is a point where you can create enormous agreement between political parties and between people who might disagree about everything, because these are, it's not my phone. I'm saying it's mine. Oh, sorry. Okay. Sorry, folks. It's okay. No. Okay. It's very quiet anyway. So we know these are the things that matter, that create well-being. Health, security, knowledge, community, freedom, ecological integrity, and equity. So there have been enough studies on each of these subjects to know this, and this is what we started out with the GPI. These are the domains that we measure for the Genuine Progress Index. So that's, an example. I have all of the components in here, but I was going to skip over that right now and talk about how using indicators and creating a set of indicators based on shared values can mobilize communities. And we have really found that to be the case in almost a way that goes way beyond what you think will happen. Because once people are involved and they're learning about themselves, they do change their behavior, and they do work together, and they do get all kinds of energy to go forward. So we look at the process itself as the value of doing indicator selection and working together. This is from actually our community indicator project, because we found that there were so many things that you cannot predict that started to come together, and so much information that you can't predict once you start to come together. For example, one thing that we found out was that what was really bothering people in Glace Bay, when we did the community work in Glace Bay, which is a kind of industrial place in Cape Breton, was vandalism. were so uncooperative and uninterested in the work that we were doing. We really needed them to be on board. Once they came to a community meeting and found out how upset people were about vandalism, which they thought of as totally unimportant, they changed their view, they changed their policy, they started to work on vandalism. Lo and behold, crime went down, and people were happier. So you can bring all kinds of ideas together if you work together on creating your set of indicators based on values. So one thing I wanted to mention about, so a couple things about PEI, I wanted to mention a couple of things. So this is from, Wendy was mentioning to me earlier. She was remembering my husband coming here to do some work around equity in PEI a number of years ago. And I thought it was very interesting that PEI is the most equitable province. Especially that women actually earn more in PEI than compared to men than they do in any other province in Canada. So, I'm skipping over these components of the Genuine Progress Index because I just wanted to talk about some other things. We've done a lot of work in Bhutan around gross national happiness. And we have worked with the Canadian, my husband was the first researcher on the Canadian Index of Wellbeing, so we worked nationally also. And we are very interested in creating models of community indicator development. So we've done some work in Bhutan with youth, and youth in partnership with communities using participative action research, which is where you not only do the research, but you actually do something about it together. So we found the volunteerism with the youth was just astounding, and we had enormous results. So first we trained the young people in various research methods, and then they went into communities and worked together with community members to determine what were the important issues and what needed to be changed. And then, so this was a community of weavers. There were 35 women, one grandpa. All the other men had left because there was no money and no jobs and no way to sustain it, and there were a lot of children. So this was the first happiness village that we worked on in Bhutan. And we worked with these young weavers and the young volunteers who interviewed them and their community. And they wanted a place to weave together, and they wanted a literacy. So first did that, then built a greenhouse, and so on and so forth. And within only 1 year, this community went from being quite poverty-stricken, having a real problem with food shortage, to having enough food to start selling it down the road, and also being able, all kinds of wonderful things happen. I won't go into any more details, but you can ask me if you're interested. And we also have brought youth to conferences. This was from a 2-week program with 220 youth from 16 countries. And recently we went back to Thailand. We worked with all of the youth organizations that were represented, and many of these same people who are so young in this picture, now they were 30, and they worked with us again, and it was fantastic. I want to, how do you click to exit? I want to call up the other file.
Okay.
Yeah, let's see, how do you?
Just go up to the top right corner.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Step by step.
Yes, thanks. Thank you. So this is a personal interest of mine because I'm the one who has to talk to people when they call and ask for help from GPI. And we're getting maybe 3 calls a week about people wanting to work at the community level and to develop indicators and measure progress at the community level, and not being able to get data at that level, or not knowing how to create it, not knowing how to use tools or create tools, and have a lot of money. We did a lot of freebies, but you know, now we give all the free stuff to the youth program, and we have to be paid for doing work with the communities, and I would really like to be using this as youth employment. I was inspired what Andrew was telling me earlier about the work with watersheds that youth are doing here in UPEI. And so we worked with these young people you just saw who are now leaders, many of them directors of youth organizations, and we were our old friends there too. So we had 35 people from 8 countries. We came together and we had some people from University of Brighton with us as well. And we were developing, this is a Train the Trainers program, and how to develop values-based indicators at the community level. So we were first, you know, eliciting the values, and we used visual methods. And then I'm not going to go into too much detail on this because you know, it is too much detail. But we found, as we were doing this, we said, wow, all the work that we've done with GPI, we could use to create a shortcut. Because now we know what really matters, we know what matters in communities, and we've worked internationally too, so we know what's universal and what's local. I mean, we've learned a lot from everyone we worked with. We worked with the Maori extensively, and in fact the GPI is the core measure of progress of the Maori Nation, and there's a course in it at the University of Otaki that you can take, that you can get a degree in. So we are quite familiar with working in other contexts, and we have learned so much from all of the people that we've worked with. For example, in Bhutan, when we were working there, they said, there's something wrong with this. Where is the indicator about having a good death? Sure enough, we didn't have that, and we were very interested in that, and I'd like to do a lot more research in that area, actually. But anyways, so, you know, we're always learning. There's, like, it's a never-ending process. But what we did with this was, you can use statements, you can turn what you know into a statement, and then see what kind of triggering it does. Like, do people share this value or not? And if so, then what is going to matter to measure it? So we did this process. This was a 2-week workshop process. So we got quite deep, and we did a lot of work in the beginning around research ethics and so on. And we did a lot of work with photos because we had translators, but we were working across multiple languages. So that was helpful. And lots of drawing to develop frameworks. And then to map them and prioritize what the values are, and then to begin to work on taking those value statements and turning them into indicators that can then be measured to track progress. So we have found this can be actually quite a fast process and a very accurate process of developing a set of shared indicators. So I'm going back actually in February, and I do know that many of these people have continued to use this work, and what they did was use it to create a work plan for their community and their community organizations that had tremendous buy-in because everybody helped create this work plan together. And they've just kept going, and it's just become more and more powerful. So very excited to go back and see exactly what they have done. We did a very detailed work after this in 2 communities in Thailand, and one in Myanmar and one in Bhutan. So anyway, I just thought I would like to just bring this up because this is what I'm excited about. And I know it's a tremendous need. My husband said to me, don't you give that talk without plugging full cost accounting. So I did my duty. I did that in the beginning. So this is what I think is exciting as well. I mean, full cost accounting is tremendous because if you can talk in dollars and cents, you can talk to governments in their language, and you can make a policy impact much, much faster. But you can start with this. I think you have to come from both ends. You can't just come trying to talk to the government and go down. you have to come up as well and work with communities and see what is really needed and what people care about. So, that's my formal presentation, actually. But I can talk on and on if you want.
Gwen, I'll just go up.
Yeah.
Yeah, we're going to do questions till the end, if that's okay. So now Jim will give his talk.
Yeah. So thank you very much, Gwen. And I've read about Gwen and Ron's work for a while. I've done a little bit of work, but nowhere near the amount of work that Gwen and Ron have done as well in this. I wanted to say a little bit about the work that we have done, I and some colleagues. And it started really in when I was at the University of Saskatchewan in Saskatoon. And I was part of a cooperative or a collaborative research organization that brought together academics from various disciplines, but also representatives from a number of community organizations in Saskatoon and the region around it, from their city council, from the health district, from housing cooperatives, and so on. And the broader objective of that group was to try to work on issues that are of relevance to the community. And we had actually 3 themes that we grouped our projects under. And one of the themes was measuring quality of life. That project that was led by Alison Williams, who's now in geography at McMaster University, looked at doing a quality of life assessment among various neighborhoods within Saskatoon at the very local level in Saskatoon. Then we we went our own way. Alison went to Hamilton, I came out here, one of our colleagues stayed in Saskatoon, and we sort of recreated several years ago a version of that project, but changed the emphasis a little bit. So rather than looking at quality of life assessment among the local neighborhood level, we then looked at in sort of medium-sized cities in Canada. And we looked at it more specifically in terms of the relationships or the assessment of quality of life among long-term residents of those 3 communities and more recent newcomers to those communities. And as you can see from this second bullet up here, by the way, I think you can hear, you don't need me to use the megaphone, right? We were more interested in the attitudes and perceptions of the residents of those places. And this, what we had done in both of those exercises, and there's a lot of other projects within Saskatoon that carried on and created a longitudinal data set on measuring attitudes and perceptions of the population. So there was a survey instrument that was created to assess the larger domains, and some of what Gwen was talking about was really looking at sort of categorizing things in domains. And there are about 60 to 70 questions. And if you look at the categories of the kinds of domains, there were things like social capital, including issues of trust and interaction with others, sense of belonging, health, sense of place, and these broader things that I think are a little bit nebulous sometimes, what we call quality of life, but specifically related to assessment of various city services across those places. We then had a follow-up focus group, set of focus groups. In this case, in Charlottetown, we had focus groups, so we had 3 focus groups. We had one with Iranian newcomers, a second with Chinese newcomers, and a third with Chinese newcomers who had been here at least 5 years. So sort of recent newcomers versus those that had been here for a little bit longer. And we also had then a third stage, sort of a triangulation with some of the stakeholders. So in our case, we tried to prove what we had found by bringing it back to the PEI Association of Newcomers and said, well, does this really sort of make sense, what we found from the broader sort of more structured surveys and the focus groups. I've got a point up there about partnering with media, because one of the things we incorporated in the early work in Saskatoon was a partnership with the Saskatoon Star-Phoenix. And so the results of the survey research were actually published in a special section of the Saskatoon Star-Phoenix. And one of the reasons we were excited about that is, as an academic, when you publish something, you might get it read by 10 people or something like that. It's a very low readership. So in one fell swoop, you can have 60 or 70,000 potential readers, or 100,000 potential readers of this. And surprisingly, when we asked the general manager of the newspaper afterwards, and they actually, it made profit for them, because they were able to sell more advertising for that special section than they would normally sell for a section of their normal newspaper. So although they viewed it as partnering up due to service, it also actually proved to generate additional revenue for them as well. And as it rolled out, it fed into municipal and regional policy change. And the group, after I left there, they actually hired a policy change person as part of the research work, who worked both with government, local and regional government, on with the results and the change in those results. So Gwen has touched on this, but how do we really measure what we value, both as a society and as individuals? And up here you see a slide that has sort of two things. I think if I was going to do the slide again, I would revise it and say that there are hybrids within here as well. So this is a little bit sort of the two extremes. At the one extreme are those people that use primarily secondary data, whether it's a human development index, some aspects of the genuine progress indicator uses secondary data, and relies upon those surrogate sort of secondary data indicators as surrogates of what we value as society. But you still ground that in what people are telling you. So whether they value some things more or less than other things. Now the advantage of this is that potentially it's easier to compare jurisdictions across jurisdictions and over time to see how those change and what changes take place. It's also potentially less expensive if you're only using secondary data as your surrogate indicators, because the data may already exist. One of the disadvantages that it depends upon the level that you're measuring. So it may not apply at the level of the neighborhood. And I've got a slide later on that talks about, because of my background as a geographer, and how I have a little bit of discomfort when we start measuring kinds of things we value at a certain geographical scale, when in fact that scale for the data doesn't match the applicability of the kinds of things we're measuring. And I'll talk about that in just a moment. And then at the other extreme, there are what I would say is more self-reflective kinds of things, of measures that we look at. And that's sort of those attitudes and perceptions. And that comes back to the work that we have done in the past. The attitudes and perceptions of individuals and how they view the world around them. And I've got quotation marks in the world around them, because that world could be at various scales. It could be at their neighborhood. It could be in their city, or it could be the province or region as well. One of the advantages of those kinds of measures is that it is a very rich and often very comprehensive and a very direct kind of data. And it can be applied at the very small scale, depending upon how many people you're actually measuring and how many people you're accessing. One of the disadvantages is that it's very costly, or it can be very costly, and it's difficult both either to generalize to a larger group or to actually see changes over time. Now ideally, as I think you've probably already gathered, it's better to do some kind, either a hybrid or to have a combination of both of these. So what I wanted to do, and this is a lot of text up here, and I don't want you necessarily to read all this, but I wanted to give you some examples from those 60 or 70 kinds of questions, how you actually might arrive at some of these values that you get at. So, for example, that if you're trying to measure quality of life, you may ask a question about how do you value, describe your overall quality of life, but that's not the only thing you say, or the only thing you ask. You also had questions on how do you rate the condition of roads and sidewalks, condition of housing, the affordability of housing, public transit traffic conditions. So there are a number of things that relate to a variety of scales of the kinds of services and kinds of activities that you as an individual find value in. And then there's this weird thing called sense of place, for example, as another sort of composite indicator of what we value. And in that, among that 60 to 70 questions, there are 16 questions actually that in some way measure a portion of sense of place. So here are a few examples from these bullets of the questions that, when you bring them together in a composite, would give you something that is a sense of, that we were comfortable with, that measured sense of place. So one of the questions was, I know many of my neighbors on a first name basis, and they check from very true to not true at all. Or how often do you participate in social activities with your neighbors, with a range, sort of a Likert scale kind of range there. Or if you had to leave your neighborhood, how many of your neighbors would you miss? So you can see that we're not asking people, well, what is your sense of place? Because that would be a meaningless question to them. But rather you're trying to come together with some type of composite surrogate indicator of these kinds of questions that are much more meaningful to them as individuals. And here's another one. And so the broader category might be social comfort or social capital. And this was a composite of answers to 4 different questions. So look at the kinds of questions that are here. Do you feel safe walking down your street after dark? And it would have a set of responses. Do you agree that most people can be trusted? Can you get help from friends when you need it? And do you think that multiculturalism makes life in your area better? So that's, once again, hopefully you see that although you're not asking a question about this abstract concept called social capital or social comfort, you're still getting at the same thing with a couple of questions that are surrogates of that. Now, I've only got a couple more slides left, but I wanted to raise this one because I've always found this very interesting. This is the National Accounts of Well-Being in the European Union. And this is an attitude perceptual kind of exercise that's at a grand scale, much grander than I could sort of hope for within what we did. So what they did, they actually had a group of researchers, and I think they were from Oxford or somewhere, that looked at this. And they did a random sample, a survey of households in every one of the countries of the EU. And they had 50 questions they posed to them. And just like we did, they had a set of domains. They had the emotional domain, satisfying life, vitality, resilience and self-esteem, supportive relationships, trust and belonging. And so you then have a set of indicators for each one of those domains for every one of the countries of the European Union. The second step that I found intriguing here is it doesn't stop there. So it's not as though this was then published and people could look it up and say, aha, we're better than Finland or we're worse than Finland. But rather, it has an educational component. So there's an online survey that once it's put up on the website, that people can actually go and do it themselves. So they can actually compare their own individual responses to the group responses in their jurisdiction and regional. So it has that ongoing educational capacity, educational element to it as well. So just a couple of takeaway concerns here from me as a geographer, being trained as a geographer. And I think Gwen alluded to this as well. Everything we measure has a reported geography or scale, regardless of whether we want it to or not. So for example, GDP or GPP, the very nature of that is that it's total economic production by a certain boundary, whether it's a country or whether it's a province or something else. When you hear crime statistics, they are often measured by either by a city or by a county or something else. There's a certain jurisdictional boundary to those kinds of measures. But every one of those things we measure also has what might be referred to as a natural scale. The scale that is more natural to the kind of phenomena you're measuring. So volunteerism, for example, volunteerism, it's meaningless to have volunteerism at a provincial level or a national level, because that isn't where volunteerism takes place. You may have people contributing at a national level in some way, but most people, when they think of volunteerism and they undertake volunteerism, it's at a town or city level or at a very local kind of level. So having a figure on the volunteerism rate for Prince Edward Island might be meaningless because of the degree of variation between the kinds of volunteerism that takes place and what is meaningful to them. Water pollution, of course, we talk about watersheds. A watershed is much more meaningful when you talk about measures of water pollution than a much broader area. Air pollution, it is probably a region, and there's this nebulous kind of boundary when we look at air pollution, perhaps. And reliance on neighbors, it's probably the family or the street around you that you would be actually measuring. But so depending upon what kind of thing you're measuring, it's a different natural scale to it. So the assessment that you're doing is kind of meaningless if there's a mismatch between that which is being reported and the so-called natural scale that you would normally think of for that kind of indicator. So safety and security, for example, if you have a measure of safety and security, it's meaningless unless it's at a neighborhood or a town level. But the challenge, of course, is that you have a lot of privacy and confidentiality issues at the small scale, and it's really difficult to get those meaningful measures at those really small scales. And I'll sort of leave you with a comment here, is PEI a living lab that can be scaled up. So one of the purposes of having this kind of discussion is, well, is there value in having some kind of measurement on PEI or sets of measurements? And if there is, what scale are we going to be looking at? And is islandness a characteristic that might be unique or identifiable on this island that might be different than if we applied, whether it's a GPI or whether it's something or some other indicator on a mainland kind of region? And I just wanted to leave you with a quote that's often made, and I'll quote it again here, but I've adapted the quote a little bit. This is by Robert Kennedy, U.S. Senator, in March of 1968. This is, by the way, about 3 months before he was killed. And he was speaking, I believe, at a university. And he said, the gross national product measures neither our wit nor our courage, neither our wisdom nor our learning, neither our compassion nor our devotion to our, and I've adapted this here, to our province. It measures everything, in short, except that which makes life worthwhile. And it can tell us everything about, and now I've sort of adapted this a little bit, it can tell us everything about Prince Edward Island, except why we are proud that we are islanders. So, and I'll leave it right at that. And Gwen.
Thank you, Jim. Wendy, did you want to say what? I'm trying to remember where it is. This one? Great.
I want to commend you folks for coming out on this evening. I really appreciate it, and I want to say how honored I am to have been asked to be part of this symposium that for the first time bears Harry's name. I had, as my bio mentioned, the pleasure of working with Harry on a number of things from about 1998 through until almost the time that I went back to the provincial government in 2008. And one of them was the Quality of Island Life Indicators Initiative. It's truly fitting that this symposium series is now named after Harry, because he had a passionate commitment to many things, but one of the things that he was most passionately committed to was informed public discourse. And the symposia that he organized all the time, and some of which I had the joy of writing background absolutely integral to that. It's often my fate as a generalist to be sort of on a panel with speakers who know far more about the topic than I do, and I have a distinct feeling that as I look out at the audience, I'm also looking at an audience that may know a great deal about this topic. For myself, as I think back to the early days, it was in 2003 that Harry first began to take, well, I think he'd long had an interest in indicators, but I think it caught his sort of organizational eye. And Harry, is, those of you who know him will remember, had a genius for coming up with ideas and coming up with projects. Often those projects involved a great deal of work and writing and research, and he also had a great ability to surround himself with people like Laurie, who were wonderful at that, and I too love doing writing and research, so it was a great match. So fortunately for my level of knowledge on this, as I looked through my files, and I'm a bit of a pack rat, when I moved back into government in 2009 from my home office, I took several folders with me. I had dozens on my shelves, but I think I took 4, and one of them was my measurement file, because it's also something that I'm deeply into. I just happen to be a data geek. I love doing charts and graphs and statistical analysis, and when I get a new table of data, I have this little happy feeling of like what previously, like what can I find from this chart of numbers that nobody's ever seen before. It's that sort of Balboa on the sort of Pacific coast feeling. So always sort of very much attuned, I think, to indicators, probably more the kind of indicators that Jim spoke of as being, you know, the data type indicators. But in later life, I'm getting a much greater appreciation of the qualitative ones as well. So that background that I wrote, naturally when Harry began to take an interest in organizing something around indicators, he organized a symposium, for which I wrote a background, and then I reread it in preparing for this, and I thought, this is actually a pretty good little compendium. So it kind of brought me back up to speed up until 2003. And then I wrote the notes of the symposium, and in going through those, I was reminded of all the good work that was going on around me, because that symposium included Dr. Colman, and I did lengthy notes on his talk, which was terrific, David Mins, and then a number of people in PEI who had been pioneers in the indicators work, and they each gave a précis of what they had done. And that was very useful. So in pulling this talk together, I began with kind of a very quick reflection on how this whole indicator thing came about. And really, I think there was a long period of time from the, euphoria of the 60s and the sort of optimism to a realization that, economic growth wasn't everything. More and more economic and more, I should say, environmental and social costs came to light from, unchecked economic growth. And so as the 1970s took place, you saw the emergence of departments of environment. As the 1980s evolved, there was the UN Commission on the Environment and Development, the Gwen Commission, that led to the Rio Earth Summit. The United Nations came out with the Index of Social Development. There was just really, like in those years in the 1980s, spurred perhaps too by the recession and by the emergence or a swing to the right on the parts of many governments, I think there was a recognition that really up until the 70s, economic growth and social development proceeded more or less hand in hand, but at that point, probably around the recession of the early 80s, they diverged and the economy continued to grow, but social well-being began to sort of diminish. And so by the time the 90s struck, there was really quite a few indicators coming forward, and there was also then, I suppose, the sort of like nature of governance in the 90s with another recession was increasing emphasis on measurement and accountability, and we can see this in many ways. Some of it was from a kind of accountability and performance point of view, but some of it was genuinely around sort of a broad look at how the society was doing. And in the provincial government, And it's been my observation that in government, which I've been sort of in or close to for almost 40 years now, that things ebb and wane, sometimes they're in vogue and then sometimes they're not. So every decade or so it appears there's been a wave of interest in measurement. And in PEI, this was really peaking in 1995 and 1996. There was an initiative within the provincial government led by a group of deputies that I was a support person to, but the lead work was done by Catherine Clough, who I'm sure some people here will remember very fondly. And that work was actually proceeding quite promisingly, but then with a change in government, a change in most of the deputy minister complement, and a change in just a new platform to implement, it basically fell by the wayside. And then, the next wave really was the wave that Harry led. So the co-op came together, and it's very, very interesting to read the notes of our meetings, because we met diligently a number of times a year, and we spent, it was a group of really brilliant, committed, passionate people, but as often happens in those situations, people brought very different points of view around what to do and how to do it. And I recall a number of discussions and this, basically we went around and around the track. At least I need to look at all the minutes again, but it seemed to me that we spent probably over a year on the question of whether we should first ask people what they wanted to measure, or whether we should measure a bunch of things and present them to the public. And there was, it's very much like the slide that you put up, Jim, about, basically the qualitative, how the people perceive it, I think, and also the point, Gwen, that you made about values. There was a strong belief on the part of some of our group that it was essential to go out and consult with people of Prince Edward Island on what was important to them, what were their values, what were their priorities, and then once we had established that we would go and gather data on that and feed it back to them and use that to basically pursue kind of needed social change. The other point of view held that it was important to take stock of where we stood first. And I think this more recently has been the dominant school of thought. It's been, because there's just been an absolute proliferation of indexes. And in preparing this talk, I confess I let myself get into the weeds trying to catch up with just what had happened since I spent more time on this. It seems every month or two a new publication comes my way, the Social Progress Index, very good piece of work. There's work by the UN, the Sustainable Development Goals, I think are marvelous. The McKinsey group has done some really fascinating work on how the Canadian provinces measure up against the UN Human Development Index. Anyway, there's just, and every time I get one of these publications, I get that little sort of, oh, I can't wait to read this feeling. But really, there are literally by now dozens of initiatives. There are dozens of frameworks. There are literally hundreds of indicators. Very easy to get bogged down in them. And there's a bit of a tendency for those to take a benchmarking kind of a thing. And actually, I have to confess I did that myself, because once I went back to government in 2008, there was then, at the time, there was work underway, which never really kind of came to total fruition, to develop a social policy framework, and or a social prosperity framework. And the approach that was taken to this was actually kind of a quality of life indicators approach. We drew together a group of officials. We struck 4 themes, one around the standard of living, one around environment, one around learning, and one around civic engagement and sort of community vitality. And then we gathered information on this, and we compared, where did PEI stand? Were we gaining ground? Were we falling behind? And as this work unfolded, the recession of 2008, 2009 also unfolded. And at a point in this work, when we brought it forward and presented it, we were directed to basically come down from that level and focus on the immediate issues of poverty, and that work then evolved into the first poverty reduction strategy. So it seems like, in hindsight, that there was a bit of a dip in those years. It seemed that there was a bit of a peak in the mid-2000s, and then there was an ebbing again. And again, I think it may have had something session. I think it frankly may have had something to do with the federal government's decision to not make the census mandatory, the long-form census, and to use the National Household Survey instead, because frankly, there were several years when I simply didn't use census data. I just went back to 2006 and waited impatiently for the 2016 to be available, but for a number of reasons it just seemed like there was a low. Now maybe that was just where I sat, perhaps I wasn't involved enough in that kind of work. But anyway, on a more encouraging note, I haven't been actually going through these slides, which pay tribute to all the great work that has been done across Canada, including the work that's been done in Nova Scotia by Ron and Gwen and their team. There has been some good work going on across Canada, and here we are into the co-op. Anyway, I'll jump through to the end, sorry, and then I'll speak for a moment to the current context, which I think is more encouraging actually than it has been in a long time. And then I'll back up to the goals and aims of the Quality of Island Life Co-op, because I think they were valid then and I think they're still valid today. So I think it's perhaps I'm biased, and I want to emphasize that I'm here to speak, I guess, as somebody who was involved in this in a volunteer or sort of a non-governmental capacity in the past, and the involvement with the Quality of Island Life Co-op was in a volunteer capacity. I'm not here to speak for the provincial government in terms of their approaches to measurement or indicators, but nonetheless, the work that I do gives me a perspective on it. And I think that there's a more favorable climate and a greater interest in the use of data, particularly social data, than I've seen in a long time. I think there's been an encouraging rebuilding of the policy capacity in the provincial government. There's been a flow of young people into the government, which gives me great joy these last, several years. There are more policy positions. People no longer kind of seek to name themselves something other than a policy analyst. It's definitely good overall, and there is, I think, an interest in getting a better evidence base for decisions. I know that I spend a fair bit of my time, as I review submissions that come to Cabinet, encouraging departments to provide better data, to provide better impact analysis, to give us a better sense of, the implications of what they're proposing. There's also, I think, this last year or so, a growing focus on social matters. I think that there was an initial focus on fiscal and economic matters, but now I see a fairly distinct kind of shifting of focus to a lot of social matters, such as the Poverty Action Plan that was announced a couple of weeks ago, which I had the opportunity to work on and to do a lot of the statistical backgrounds for, which I enjoyed. There's also a lot of cross-departmental work going on, and a couple of notable ones. I want to pay tribute to the work of Dr. Heather Mudison here, our Chief Public Health Officer, whose office does outstanding data analysis. Her report in 2016 drew attention to something that Dr. Colman, Dr. Colman had already highlighted 10 years earlier, and that is the linkage between economic disparities and health disparities. So the focus of that 2016 report by Heather was on basically Islanders' health by their income status. And that's something that I see far more often nowadays than I used to, that it will be analyzed through those kinds of lenses. Then her report in 2017 focused on children's well-being, and there has been work underway ever since. Now, at the time, she found that there were many barriers and challenges to doing that work, and it's just around the obstacles. It's not around people, it's around the obstacles within government to data sharing across departmental barriers, and the fact that a lot of data is basically gathered and kept in a way that makes it difficult to analyze. It's manual, or it's not longitudinal, or there's any number of things. So she's indicated that there will need to be improvements in data capacity within government before she would undertake, a renewed version. As well, that poverty plan that I mentioned, there was a lot of work that went into an indicators framework for that, which I was also able to participate in. And the plan that was released a couple of weeks ago only mentioned 6 basically kind of headline indicators that will be monitored. But as the plan is developed, there's an intention, to carry out an evaluation framework, which is also something that had fallen into disfavor in the past, and which is now becoming much more kind of valued. So an evaluation framework, and I anticipate that there'll be a pulling together of a fairly broad range of social well-being indicators in support of that. So I hope to be part of that, and I'm encouraged. The poverty plan does call for the development of a data plan, and so there's work underway, I think, to increase government's capacity to do more analysis, and there's also, I think, a greater commitment to making that data and those findings public than there has been in the past. So I'm going to jump back to the Quality of Life Island Co-op and their mission. As I say, I think really these things have resonance, and they have resonance today. So we hoped, and I think, hindsight, we were fairly, we were a brave little band of people, I think. It was a hugely ambitious agenda. Yet, I think we started with tremendous optimism and hope. I don't know how many of you are gardeners, but it's somewhat the same feeling that you have in early May as you think about your garden for the summer. And so we hope to provide a more complete and accurate picture of the state of Prince Edward Island. We wanted to promote broad public engagement and critical discussion on how best to measure the well-being of islanders, and that speaks to the point that Gwen has made, that often the process can be the product, or certainly one of the most valuable products that comes out of these exercises, that simply through the process of talking about what we value and discussing these things as growth in knowledge and in awareness. We hope to promote more attention by policymakers to non-economic measures of progress, and I think that has certainly happened. And lastly, we hope to inject a unique Prince Edward Island contribution to the growing field of measurement, and that speaks to some of the points that Jim has made about scale, about islandness, which of course was always very much in Harry's mind, and I think also the sort of level of civic engagement and the involvement that people here have in public discourse. So I think we were pretty sure that we could actually have a meaningful impact on this field. So our mission was to carry out public engagement on what constitutes well-being and quality of life, and to conduct and communicate rigorous quantitative and qualitative research. And there was some of that done. Harry also had, I think, a genius for partnerships, and I met many amazing people through him. Among those were the community accounts folks in Newfoundland, Doug May and Alvin Pollitt, and they were remarkably generous with their work, and they worked with us to set up a PEI community account system applied in Tyne Valley. Those reports are still available. I was just looking through them. And I'm not sure if anybody has an archive of the Quality of Island Life Co-op, but basically I could probably kind of fill it up with documents if people are interested. Anyway, led to a report, and that work was really foundational by the Quality of Island Life Co-op, foundational in an effort then by government. It was acknowledged in the throne speech, and it led eventually to the establishment of the PEI system of community accounts. Now, that system is still there. It can be found on the government website. Now, it has not actually been refreshed with the 2016 data, but there is an intent to do that, I think, as part of the follow-on with the Poverty Action Plan. I'll certainly be pursuing that if I can. So as I say, it's an encouraging time for this kind of work. I think there's still a huge place for public involvement in that work. I think looking back on the Quality of Island Life Co-op and looking at some of the sort of very large, well-funded examples that we've cited here today of corporations, think tanks, and universities, not sure how feasible it is for a small kind of community organization to do that from scratch, but I certainly think that an organization like that still has a place and still needs to be a part of work like that. So I guess that is pretty much I've covered in a very meandering way. Yeah, possibles of measurement, and if anyone has any questions, I would be really happy to try and answer them.
Along with Gwen and
Thank you. So we have a few minutes for questions. Does anyone have the first question?
I have a question for the audience in general, I guess. Is anybody here from the town of Stratford? No? Yes? Are you aware of the survey they do annually? The questions that are asked, I think, are very similar to the examples, Jim, that you had in your measures. And I don't know what prompted them to begin that survey. It's a number of years it's been going on, and it's fairly well, the collection is quite large. I think 1,000 people or so respond. Just curious about whether there's potential for them to take that down and go backwards and do some sort of quality of life analysis of it.
and I had heard of that, but not being from Stratford or being involved in the municipal politics, I guess the question I would have is, how is that fed into their public policy framework? In which way have they actually used that? I'm sure they have, but it's just, has it been done on a almost like a superficial level, looking at various tables and saying, oh, we have to do this, or whether has it been done, have they used it a little bit more systematically? Maybe you might know.
I can probably speak to that. I used to be on the committee for the town of Stratford that actually reviewed the survey every year. It definitely featured fairly strongly in our committee's work. We, like I said, we reviewed it, the outcomes and everything. I think the idea behind it was really just to have more data for the town.
For making town decisions.
For making decisions. And from what I could tell, from my role on that committee, that was fairly well followed. And I know that the CAO there, Robert Hughes, was a big proponent of it.
The town certainly has a reputation of being responsive to the citizens, but I'm just happening to be working on a small marketing campaign for them. I don't live in Stratford, but when I saw the data that came in as a result of this survey, I feel it's very rich, but I just, there's also more potential there for it.
Yeah, some of the data from the survey also goes to, feeds into the town's official plan, and they actually have a sort of a performance management framework set up. It's still, I'm not sure it's quite finished, but they've been developing it, and some of the survey data was, some of the work that I was involved with was kind of finding which data is needed to measure performance of the town as a whole.
And I think it changed slightly over the years, but there is a core that shows progression and shifts as well. I don't know that other municipalities in the province are doing such a thing. Wendy, do you know? Certainly nobody in Charlottetown ever surveyed me.
I'm not sure. Stratford's always been progressive. They've had a sustainability officer for a long time, and yeah, I'm not aware. There was, I think, trying to think back on some of the work that was done by youth groups in Charlottetown, would have explored elements of, quality of life in Charlottetown. I think there was the youth advisory group in Charlottetown that examined, issues around youth and city.
Well, I'm aware of some that are done by the community foundations. Can you hear me?
Vital signs.
But yes, vital signs, and we've used in the past. We've used vital signs a lot. I do not like the trend that is going on with the community foundations because they don't share the data with the communities in the transparently. They don't show the methodologies and everything behind it. They just publish results. And the communities don't own the research. To me, those are issues. And also, they don't cooperate to compare research across other jurisdictions. They don't share it. they want to own it and, manipulate it however they like. And so, I find it a little suspect because how useful is it? It can, and the people that put the money into paying for it are also mostly corporations. So anyway, I had hoped for more, let's say, because had a lot of potential there. But anyway, I've said that to their faces. So.
There's a very strong municipal framework. The Federation of Canadian Municipalities has done, outstanding kind of measurement work for 20 years, so there's a good basis to work with there in terms of frameworks.
Do we have another question? I have a question for Gwen, which is what I've been dying to ask. That's in Bhutan, where this is fairly advanced. They've been measuring well-being for a while. What has that actually resulted in? What changes have happened because of that?
I don't know how advanced, but we've been working there since. Can you hear me?
Yep, sure do.
I don't even know if this is on.
Just push it straight.
Okay, never mind. I don't need to take it out. It's just if you can hear me. Can you hear me? Okay. Okay. In answer to that, we've been working in Bhutan since 2003, and they actually found our work on website, called us up and said, can you come help us and consult on this, because we've been talking about this for 30 years, but we don't know how to create a framework. And actually, we've worked with them since 2003 on creating that framework, and they've gotten, of course, much more sophisticated over the years and done so much work themselves, and especially the Center for Bhutan Studies. But they didn't actually have a framework in 2003, so it's since then that they've been working on developing that. However, Bhutan has been a wonderful social experiment, and we've been extremely privileged because it's a sovereign country that is willing to try out basically what is the GPI is exactly the same as the gross national happiness, just that holistic measure of progress. And one of the really exciting things that we worked on there with the government that's still in use is called the GNH lens. And Mike and Martha Pennock, who were at Acadia but are now at the University of Victoria, worked on that with us as GPI researchers. And so now, because of the shared values that Bhutan has as a country, that gross national happiness is more important than gross national product, they created basically 6 questions, which are not, they have the national accounts going, they have indicators, that so on and so forth. This is much more simple. It's just 6 questions. And that is called the GNH lens that is used by the Planning Commission of Bhutan for all new projects and all new budgets every year. And it's very exciting, and I think it has tremendous potential. We've done some workshops on it here in Canada. And there is a version that we've adapted for Canadian use. It needs a lot more work, frankly. And if we get some more money, we will develop that some more. But it's another way of looking at things, because you can sift down when you have the set of indicators and you have established the shared values. You can sift that down into a fairly direct formula, but when you use it, when you actually go through using this lens, the results can be quite surprising. So that's that, and I think that it's constantly being refined, and the government has changed again. When we started working in Bhutan, it was not a democracy, and then became one in 2008, and then changed governments again into kind of a more, Indian-controlled government, and now is changing governments again. So, seeing what lasts through all these government changes, like Wendy was talking, and which measurement system is in fashion at the time. We'll see. We'll have to ride that out and see.
Any other questions? Yes?
In this, when you said shifting the mindset from gross national product to gross national happiness, how do you make that culture shift when all around us, south of the border, the president doesn't care about social equity and people's happiness? You're seeing all of these right-wing kinds of governments that are popping up all over the place, and so it seems like it's shifting really the other way. What can we do?
Okay, I gotta say two things about that. Yes, it's terrifying.
Yeah.
Absolutely terrifying. And you know, I was in Thailand. The Thai people are terrified because, you know, I had Cambodian elections, a very repressive Cambodian government, and I have 4 Indigenous youth interns in Cambodia right now. I'm quite worried, actually, about the diciness of the whole situation there. So, yes, it's taken its toll, and at the same time, there is an opposite effect. And I can't prove this with statistics and so on and so forth, but I have, for instance, one of my close friends works at World Wildlife Fund, and in the same building as the Obamas, who attend the staff meetings of World Wildlife Fund. And so she's kind of in on the other side, and she said, you know, what's interesting is there's way more money. All of a sudden, she raises money for World Wildlife Fund, that's her job. And so she said there's just way more money available because people are afraid, so they feel like, well, they cannot be complacent anymore. They have to put their money and their effort where their mouth is if they want to not just be dragged down completely. So the other side is that there's tremendous more effort going into progressive measures. And I don't know what's going to happen. I really have no idea what is going to happen from our southern neighbors and their influence on the world. It really just depends on how successful Trump is, and I guess in some kind of economic amazing feat or something by the end of his term. I don't know what will happen, but I do know that nevertheless, France, Germany, in some way the UK, and in some way Italy, and 20 states in the United States now have legislation in the pipeline for adopting the Genuine Progress Indicator as a core measure of progress. New Zealand already is, you know, and we've done tremendous amount of work in New Zealand. And Bhutan is, you know, it's a wonderful, happy story because it's this tiny little country. Not that they don't have problems, it's not Shangri-La, and you know, they've had bad press for certain decisions they've made in the past, but you know, it is a wonderful social experiment where you can see results, and Denmark is another one. So I think that there is also the opposite side and a tremendous movement toward more holistic measures of progress. And also, I find what I love about doing this work, and Jim might agree with me about this, is that when you're doing it, you really see how much people really care about other people and about their communities and about wanting to make a difference and about wanting to make a better life for everyone. So it's just so heartening. So I think there's also that other side is also growing and getting stronger.
Can I just speak a little bit to that? And Laurie, you'll know this from some of the conversations we've had with our colleague in New Zealand recently. And we're working on a project that is trying to look at measuring ways of, I guess you would really call it sort of sustainable development across islands, looking at pairs of islands, those that are independent nation states versus those that are subnational island jurisdictions. And one component of that research project is sort of a survey instrument and some qualitative analysis as well. And we've been reminded over the last couple of weeks when we've been talking to colleagues in Guam and Palau and elsewhere that, that whatever we do has to be meaningful to the people themselves. Because for so long, they've had largely external agencies that have come and imposed upon them sort of some kind of measurement device that is then used in ways that has no positive implications And I think it points to be one of the other challenges associated with it, to say nothing of individuals, but rather this almost a human tendency to compare. To say, well, like the EU well-being sort of measures. Aha, we're better than Spain, or we're doing worse than Spain. And it's the same thing with the Maclean's index for universities, etc. Have we gone up a notch or gone down a notch, etc.? And I think we have to avoid that trap because for people that are, as Gwen as suggested just a moment ago, they're more interested in their own well-being and the well-being of their neighbors. And that's got nothing to do with how they're doing in relationship, how Charlottetown's doing in relationship to Stratford or Cornwall or something else. So I think we have to keep that in mind in terms of the work that we do, is to not fall into that trap of measurement for determining whether you've been successful or not in relationship to others.
I would certainly echo that. I think most people, there's very little point in telling people that, you know, if the situation is difficult, that it's slightly worse in Nova Scotia. You know, I think that there is some relevance. People do find relevance in whether a trend is improving or declining. But I agree, the ranking thing can be kind of pernicious, and it's too easy to get caught up in that. On an encouraging note to Lori's question, I do think the Sustainable Development Goals by the United Nations provide a very kind of coherent and robust framework. I think there are so many indicators, initiatives by now that it's possible to get lost in this welter of data and measures, and it's organized this way, it's organized that way. I think there's a lot to be said for a single organizing framework that people can align to, and that one struck me as having a great deal of merit. It's recently had the opportunity in my volunteer life to prepare a proposal, or help prepare one for Global Affairs Canada, and so I had an opportunity to sort of experience the implications of the feminist international development policy that Gwen has mentioned, that the work contributed to, and I think it really will make a difference as well. So I think there are many beams of light, but it's often hard to see them because of some of the things that we do hear about and read about every day that can be very discouraging.
Oh, we have one more question in front here.
I'm just wondering if the Island Studies have any plans to actually go out in the community and make some measurements on quality of life, and to make measurements to determine what our citizens feel are factors that influence their quality of life.
Well, it's an interesting, I didn't plant you with that question as well, but that's in fact one of the reasons why we had this symposium, is to see whether is there's an appetite for something like this on Prince Edward Island, and to create a project through the Institute that might allow us to do that.
Well, the Center for Island Study, Center for Study of Health and Aging did such a project back in 1995. We published papers on it. We presented papers on it. Nothing happened. But those materials can certainly be used on a broader scale than simply studying a random sample of people who address the entire community.
Yeah. Thanks.
To add to that, the work that was done by the Quality of Island Life Co-op, they did the study in Tyne Valley that was subsequently published, and part of that work did include consulting the people in the community on the things that made their life, that were most important to them in terms of their quality of life and well-being. So I think it touched on things that, you know, may seem intangible, like neighborliness and things like that. That report is also there as a resource.
Time for one more question, anyone? Yes, Patrick?
Yeah. It kind of follows up a little bit on that, the last question. If we were going to do this on PEI, I'm kind of wondering what's the best entity to lead it? You know, the Institute has been sort of suggested here, but government is also working in here. We may have non-profit groups, other groups. And keeping in mind as well that we want this ideally to be, we presumably would want this ideally to be sort of a bottom-up approach. So kind of wondering within that as well, if government is leading it, will it automatically be top-down, or can we do this in a bottom-up way with different partners?
Well, maybe I'll take that. I'll sort of Wendy did that. I guess I'm a firm believer that you can sort of operate on both ends, and that's why maybe I use that one example. It doesn't have to be the sort of the MEU kind of indicator, but to me, the reason why that's appealing to me is partly because I have a bit more of an affinity to the attitudinal perceptual side of it. But also it's not just a one-shot deal. It's not top-down where, well, I've got these 60 or 70 questions that therefore will define how sort of people feel about themselves in the neighborhoods. And maybe but that's just a starting point. So we may do something like that or have a version of that. But then you sort of roll out some kind of communications vehicle to encourage people to participate themselves. And so you have to think not just of communicating what those results might be, but then get people engaged in taking those themselves, and whether that's a participation approach or something else that sort of that would have people see how they're doing, and not just sort of what their final score is in relationship to the average, but perhaps what that means. So you'd have something else around it about what kind of policy change might take place in order to improve that domain or that component, and what that does that. And it's not just perhaps that I'm just sort of rambling here, but I know, but it's not just that somebody might do an online version of it, see how they are, but maybe you could have sort of a town forum where you bring people together and say, well, look, this is what we've got for this sort of region or this community. Let's look at that, and why don't we all as a group sort of take that and analyze that, have a discussion about what the results are. So I think we need sort of to think through that, but I think it can be top down as a starting point. As okay, well here's one interpretation of it. Now we've got that as a starting point. Then what are we going to do with that?
I think there's a role for both government and the community. I think the government is they originate much of the data, things like, monitoring data of water quality. They gather statistical data, so they have a hugely important role in gathering data and organizing it and making it available for public review, and that's not really something I think that can be undertaken very easily by any other entity in a cross-societal way. I think, outside of government, sure, you can do a specific survey and that adds a lot of value, but that big picture everything piece, that's a government piece, I think. And I think that there's a role for government as well in just basically releasing things like the State of the Environment report on a periodic basis, State of the Forest. But I think there's also enormous value in having things happen outside of government. It gives a different perspective, sometimes perhaps a little more critical scrutiny, shines a light maybe where government hasn't shone a light. And as we've all, I think, mentioned, there's value in members of the public just going through those processes together for what they gain from it, what they learn, and so yeah, I see a role for both. As I mentioned, I'm not sure. Actually, as we were speaking of this, an idea flashed into my mind. I don't know if it's a good one. It flashes sometimes out, but almost sort of an open source kind of a thing. That if there were a framework there, sort of a coherent framework, that organizations, if they were doing work in the community, they could just plug their findings or their insights in wherever it belonged. It could have a peer review kind of quality like Wikipedia. So creating those big systems all at once is a hugely expensive undertaking, but perhaps something like that could just be kind of built in a collective kind of a fashion. It just needs the organizing principles. That's just, as I say, a sudden flash, but yeah, I see a very valuable role for external kind of
I think we'll leave it there, seeing as it's well past 8:30. I'd like to thank the presenters again for excellent presentations, and especially Gwen for making it all the way from the mainland in this weather. Thank you so much.
Thanks. I'd like to thank Lauren Brinklow for a lot of the organizing work, and Mike Mooney, our videographer here as well.